before I was diagnosed with ADHD, I before I had a career, before all these things, my personality developed, I had my breath. And that was actually the beginning of my life. And that breath has a rhythm to it.
ADHD Rewired, episode 411. This is the podcast for those of us with really good intentions and a slightly wandering attention. I'm Eric Tivers. I'm a licensed clinical social worker by training and a coach by design. I'm your host, and I have ADHD. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. We are a community. We are wired for connection, and you are not alone. Go to ADHDrewired.com to learn how you can join us in our free and secret Facebook group. Get additional resources for every episode, including links to any resources we mention on today's show. You can support us on Patreon, sign up for our email newsletter. You can request podcast postcards to distribute to your clients and support groups. Learn all about our award-winning coaching and accountability groups. You can co-work with us in our Adult Study Hall virtual membership community. You can do all of these things by going to our website at ADHDrewired.com. We know that starting is the hardest part, so let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of ADHD Rewired. Today's guest is Alejandro Santiago. Alejandro is a mindfulness life coach and yoga instructor. He first experienced the benefits of mindfulness and breathwork when he was a student at Parsons School of Design in New York City. To cope with the stress of ADHD and university, he cultivated a practice of pranayama, an ancient form of yogic breathwork. Did I say that right? The pranayama?
Yes.
All right, cool. Today, he's teaching people how to get out of their heads and into their breath by merging the Western practice of mindfulness based in self-compassion and yogic pranayama. It feels weird saying it. Pranayama. Tell me I'm saying that right.
It was beautiful. Pranayama.
Pranayama. Okay. Yogic pranayama meditations. He studied compassionate inquiry with Dr. Gabor Maté, a therapeutic approach to uncover and heal trauma in our bodies. When he's not teaching and coaching, he works as a portrait photographer in Toronto. Alejandro, I am really happy to have you on the podcast. It's been too long since we've been talking about having you come on.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Eric. Yeah, I joined ARC and I did the coaching program back in, I believe, 2018. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. And I have to say that your work has been and the work with the entire community has been so helpful for me to just move beyond my, kind of my limitations and my trauma around ADHD, around stress, around just, being alive. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you kind of got into meditation and somewhat under the same sort of circumstances that I did when I was in grad school after I got fired from my internship, and I was kind of freaking out like that I wasn't going to finish grad school, and the anxiety was so bad that I needed to do something. And that's where I first learned how to meditate. So it sounds like you were kind of going through a similar stressor, but you went really deep into this.
Yeah, I was living in New York, and I had, I've always been interested in meditation, and I had read books about it. But it was when I took a very first class in breathwork that in a room full of people, and typically, when I'm in a room full of people, I can't help but look around and see what's going on around me, especially like in a yoga class, I'm comparing myself to others. And this was different because we were invited to close our eyes, and we did all sorts of different breath practices and movement exercises with our eyes closed. And it was so liberating for once to not care about what anyone else is doing in the room, and to just, it was the first time I think I was able to be surrounded by people and just feel really connected to myself and felt liberated from not worrying about what I looked like compared to somebody else or what they were doing versus me. And I left that class feeling completely exhilarated. I felt like I had run a marathon, but also I felt like I ran a marathon around a church, because I felt completely like connected to myself, but also energized. I had this kind of real sense of, just a new level of awareness, and it lasted for days, and I couldn't wait to do it again. And so I just became more and more curious about this and started studying more, practicing more. And I took a teacher training back in my early 20s, not because I ever wanted to be a teacher. I couldn't ever expect myself to teach. I just wanted to learn more about this because I wanted to deepen my own practice. there's something about when you learn something that might help you or might help somebody else that you really listen. And little by little, I started teaching people. I started to share little things that I found really helpful. And that was kind of the beginning of me becoming a teacher. Yeah.
So how long has it been since you've been doing this work then? So you said you started in your 20s. So how old are you now?
I'm 41. I just turned 41 a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
All right. Well, happy birthday to you. And so this journey that you've been on with this has taken you to a lot of different places. You've done some intense studying with some really well-known teachers. You said you did you studied compassionate inquiry with Dr. Gabor Maté. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I came across that through a program called Beyond Addiction that uses a lot of these yogic practices and connects it with Gabor Maté's work on addiction. And Gabor Maté is just a fantastic teacher and doctor, and he works a lot in the field of trauma and in addiction. One of his first books was called Scattered Mind, and it's all about ADHD. And one of the things that I love about him and his work is that because he also has ADHD, he can really connect with that. And he really empathizes with that. And he really connects with the emotional aspects of living with ADHD. You know, actually, it was during the pandemic, when the pandemic started, that I needed to, I want to further my learning and further just my connection to this work. So I signed up for this program of compassionate inquiry. It's one of the deepest journeys that I've taken into myself, because it's about learning where we hold trauma in our bodies. And as people who have ADHD, I'll speak for myself. I spend a lot of time in my head. And what I mean by that is that, instead of actually connecting with my body, instead of being in my body, it's constantly the mind that's constantly racing and moving through. And one of the really profound teachings of this practice is, oftentimes we say things like, I feel like it's not going to work out, or I feel like a failure. I feel like everything's on the right track, but none of those are actually feelings, right? Those are perceptions.
Right.
And underneath that, there is a feeling. And so when I started to kind of dive into into some of these perceptions that I was carrying, and I was asked, well, where do you feel this in your body? Where do you feel this feeling? And what's behind that idea of there's something different about me, And I would always point to my head, because I was so disconnected from my physical body, and breathwork really helped me get into that. But when we're triggered, we often become disconnected from our body. And that's what he describes as trauma, is that trauma isn't necessarily the event that happens to you, like parents divorcing or somebody passing away or some kind of abuse. Those are traumatic situations and experiences, but the trauma is that we become disconnected from ourselves, from who we think we are, from who we are. We start to lose sight and hope in the future, in the world. We lose sight and hope of others and of ourselves. So this is a practice of becoming more aware and more centered in where you carry trauma in your body, where these emotions reside. Like, where does shame reside? And when you feel shame, where do you feel that? So instead of being in your head and being with the story of that shame or the fear of that perception of like, oh, people are going to laugh at me, it's like, where does that sensation reside in your body? And that's something that I bring into my meditative work, is I encourage people to become curious about what are they carrying physically, any physical tension in their body. Is there an emotion connected to that physical sensation? The soreness that you feel in your lower back, the tightness in your chest when it's your turn to speak, the clammy hands that start to sweat, and even your posture, because all of that physical sensation has an emotional component to that. And so learning to become still, to become curious around that, for me was a real challenge, to learn how to do that and to learn how to hold space for others in doing that, how to guide people to be able to spend time with themselves, to spend time becoming curious. Because for people who have ADHD, for myself, it's really hard. It's really hard to be alone with ourselves. And, my early years in New York, when I was living by myself with no family, and I was a little bit wild, staying up too late, drinking too much, partying too much, I never wanted to be alone. Mm. And so when I took that very first class, I realized, I'm like, oh my God, I've been here with myself. This is the longest I've been able to be silent, to be with myself. And that stayed with me, that experience stayed with me, that I wanted more, and I wanted to learn more about this. So these are all experiences that I bring as a coach. And as a teacher, when I teach these mindfulness breathwork sessions, is always taking time to become aware of what's present within you. And when that judgment shows up, which it inevitably does, because it's subconscious, when that inner judge, that inner critic shows up, to just notice it, to just become aware of it. And notice if there's pain, to see if we can find a little bit of compassion for that pain, compassion for all that we've been carrying, instead of trying to do more, to breathe more, instead of trying to do more or to focus more, but to step back and just create a little bit of space of awareness around that. I often say that meditation is seen as this passive act that we do. And it's like, we want to relax and we want to feel good, but really meditation is about creating clarity within yourself. I think that it's a very rebellious act almost, and I think self-care and self-love, it's the hardest thing to do. And if anything, if I've learned anything over these last 2 years of isolation and pandemic life, is that self-care for me is non-negotiable. It's something that I need. So through meditation, it's really about building this new relationship to yourself, to your trauma, through your breath, through your body. And the breath is what connects the physical sensation of the body and the mind. And that's the nervous system, right? So through this breath work, we develop this new relationship to ourselves, this new self-awareness through breath awareness. Yeah.
Now you, when we were talking last week, there were two things that you said that I took note of, because I just thought it was an interesting sort of idea to ponder. And that one, self-care is an act of rebellion, and two, meditation is an act of defiance. Will you speak to both of those?
Yeah. So, I say that because, I think also there's a little bit of a rebellious streak in a lot of people who have ADHD. I say myself included. And the reason I say that is because, and this is where I encourage people, it doesn't matter about your level of focus when you're doing this. More important is that curiosity and that awareness. And that first curiosity and awareness is that if you sit down to meditate or to do anything for your own good, that right there is a huge win for yourself. The reason I say it's an act of rebellion is because, your email isn't telling you to meditate. Your Instagram isn't telling you, your job isn't telling you, your family isn't telling you, the news isn't telling you. So in order to disconnect from all of those things that want our attention, that want a piece of us, takes a lot of willpower. It takes a lot of determination. There's like this kind of paradox in that, in the one hand, it's this rebellious act where you're creating the space for yourself, but it's also a very nurturing act, and so it's like kind of protecting this time to yourself. It's often in these experiences of meditation that I felt the most compassion for other people, where I felt most connected to other people, because I felt a deep sense of peace within me. And in finding and in uncovering some of the trauma and some of the challenges and being able to mourn that, some of those challenges, I realized that everyone else has their own version of these traumas. Everyone has a version of I'm not good enough, of this is really hard, and these last couple of years have been really hard. Just remembering that, and finding that space and that time for yourself is an act of defiance, and to take this time for yourself. It's creating this new habit of learning to be with yourself. And sometimes that's really hard for myself too. And, one of the reasons I teach is because it helps bring me closer to this. And one of the things that I love about the art community is that I've seen myself reflected in so many other people, regardless of where they are in their journey, whether they're just starting out and just recently diagnosed, or whether they're having a good day, or whether they're slipping, and they're triggered in some way. And so being able to see myself reflected in other people is it's such a rare gift, and it's so humbling, Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I we probably have all heard this idea of people with ADHD believe that, they can't meditate because they have ADHD. And maybe it's what makes it hard to meditate is also the very same reason that it's so critically important. I think there's a lot of myths around meditation. One of the ones that I like to talk about the most is that the goal of meditation is to clear your mind, right? Like, it's a nice outcome occasionally when that happens, right? It's like, it's a nice feeling. And I think when I first started learning meditation, one of the things that when I would have these sort of really meaningful insightful, mind clearing sort of meditation sits, right? Like, and then it's like, oh, I hope my next one's going to be like that. And as soon as I start thinking that, it's like now I'm out of my body again and back into my head, thinking and anticipating and wanting something certain to happen. And one of the things that, when we talk about sort of curiosity and non-judgment, is to notice, right? To intentionally notice that you maybe had like 1,000 thoughts in the last minute. Just noticing that without judgment. And, I always like to sort of equate it to watching the theater of my mind, and just noticing that my mind is super busy in this given moment is actually a really helpful thing to notice. Because then it's like, oh, wait a minute. I'm actually feeling anxious. I didn't even realize that because I had so much buzzing in my head. And so I think that getting back into our bodies is so critically important. It's one of the things that I've been, over the last number of years, been kind of learning to come back to as a social worker. I think a lot in grad school, they sort of teach, like, we're very data driven, which is like, yes, that's important, and evidence-based practices are important. But I guess for me, one of the things that it almost gave me permission to do was to use that intellectualization as a defense mechanism that I had, somewhat already, and almost validate it as like, oh, this is a good thing to do. And it's like, so I stopped listening to my intuition for a while. So this coming back to that has been such I don't want to say rewarding. It's been a grounding experience, because I really do believe and feel that our intuition is a type of intelligence.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And it requires just being. Sometimes to notice it requires to observe and do nothing else with that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. There's so much there to kind of unpack. And the first thing I'll say is that there are many different types of meditation, just like exercise. You can jog, you can use a stair climber, you can lift weights. So there's a lot of different types of meditation. And so I teach a lot of different forms of breath work. And I always do a little bit of practice, including the body with a little bit of movement, because so often we're just so in our heads that just connecting with the body, one of the things I noticed is as soon as we close our eyes, one of the things we become aware of is all the tension we're holding in our bodies. And so just moving that, doing these little breathwork exercises that move the body is really good to release some of that physical tension. And so I always like to think that my classes and the way that I teach, there's 3 qualities that I encourage people to explore. The first one is curiosity, is becoming aware of what's present within you, noticing the mind that's judging all the time, that's constantly moving. The second is compassion, when you find yourself triggered by something, by an emotion, by just not being able to focus as deeply as you'd like. And the third one is commitment, coming back to the breath and becoming aware of your breath. So I like to think that we have our physical body, we have our mind, and the breath is what kind of sits and resides in the nervous system that balances the physical and the mental, the emotional. Typically, we're in our heads a lot and we're not connected to what's going on with the body. And so in my classes, one of the things that I really like to do is to engage the body, engage the mind. So I feel like by the end of the class, we're bringing the mind and the body together in kind of unison. And I think it's when you find that flow state that's when the intuition really arises. And that's where you start to kind of learn how to relate to yourself, not just through your mind, not just through your past, but just through this awareness where you become the watcher, you become the observer. You're obviously having the thoughts, but there's that little bit of space between the thoughts and the reaction to the thoughts.
I'll give you all a moment to have a reaction to those thoughts, and we will come back to this conversation in just a moment. We will be right back. Growth through community. That's what we're all about here at ADHD Rewired. Our registration kickoff event for our spring sessions is just a few weeks away. We're going to be doing it on February 3rd at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. And we are growing. This spring, ADHD Rewired is thrilled to have Kat Hoyer join the ADHD Rewired coaching team. Kat was a coaching group member way back in season 8. I think it was season 8. And Kat and I have collaborated on a number of things since. You heard her recently on the podcast. She's been leading a session of Ash Plus around job and career search related activities. So I am just super excited that she will be joining us as an ADHD rewired coach. And all of our friends across the pond in Australia and New Zealand. I know that you've been waiting for a group that works for your time zone that doesn't require you to wake up at 4 a.m. And Kat is going to be offering a time that hopefully will work for you. So check the website for details, see times and sessions for all of our groups. This season, I'm only going to be doing one group in the spring. So if you really want to join my session, I would encourage you to come to the Kickoff event. Join me and ADHD rewired coaches Roxy Martin, Moira Mabin, and Kat Hoyer. It's been almost 8 years since I launched ADHD rewired coaching and accountability groups. I understand how it feels to go through life feeling misunderstood. And that is why I created this community. Now, we've grown from just a small group to an entire community of growth-minded adults with ADHD who have learned that they can do hard things, that we can do hard things. The pain of feeling helpless or hopeless is real. And with the right support and with the right people, we've now had over 750 members discover that they can do hard things. ADHD is real. It can make it seem like we are going through life on hard mode. And it's even worse when we feel like we have to do it alone. In ADHD Rewired's award-winning coaching and accountability groups, you won't have to face your challenges alone. If this sounds like the community you want to be a part of, we'd love to have you. Get on our spring season interest list now by going to coachingrewired.com and click on the big button at the top of the page to add your name to our interest list. Then keep an eye out in your email so you can stay up to date for all of our upcoming registration events and dates for our spring sessions. Take your ADHD management to the next level and take your next steps to living your wholehearted life with ADHD. Yes, ADHD will present its challenges, but you really don't have to face your challenges alone. This is the coaching community for adults with ADHD by adults with ADHD, where our hope is you won't feel helpless or hopeless anymore. Rather, you will experience learning, growth, and connection. Come join us. Go to coachingrewired.com. That's coachingrewired.com. And we are back with Alejandro Santiago. All right. So right before the break, we were sort of talking about how intuition comes from when the mind and body are sort of connected and are both kind of aware of each other. And you were also saying that there are lots of different kinds of meditation. And, for people who have been listening to this podcast for a while, know how sort of like averse I am to the woo-woo. But what, I know just from what I have studied, what a lot of the supporting data on specifically on mindfulness-based meditation. But I've also seen, and I haven't done a ton of research on this, but I have seen that there's some similar data that shows similar health benefits even in prayer. Now, I am not a religious person in the slightest, right? I'm not someone who prays, right? But I think any contemplative practice, I have to imagine, does very, very similar things, right? Mm-hmm. And I think anything that can allow us to slow down and sort of stay with any experience for, more than 7 seconds is going to be beneficial, right?
Absolutely.
I always find it sort of interesting, sometimes a little concerning, when people who are not trained as mental health professionals are sharing some of the space with stuff around mental health, right? So you're doing training around trauma work as a coach who has received training in breathwork and yoga. And How do you sort of stay in that space where you're practicing in a way that is professionally has that integrity without crossing over to that therapy space, especially when you're helping people to do breath work and body work through working through trauma without really addressing the trauma? So what has your training kind of taught you about that?
Well, the training about this for me, well, first, I guess, I think my first is actually my own experience through trauma. And I think I should just talk about that
Okay.
is where growing up with ADHD, and I think I mentioned earlier about being a student in New York, is that I felt really alone. And I think this feeling of being alone, and, we're talking about the mind and how the mind works and how the ADHD brain works. And the truth is that we only have our connection to our own mind. So one of the things for me has been all the therapy that I've done actually to move through my own trauma, because you can't hold space for somebody else if you still have so much that you're working on. And so much of my work has been just developing that awareness of myself. And so I would say that breath work does not replace any kind of therapeutical work, but it can be a very important, powerful tool to help move beyond that. And so I encourage everyone to seek out the resources and the support that they need when something like this is uncovered. And so one of the things with breathwork specifically is that trauma often is within our bodies, and it's connected to our nervous system. So I teach people different techniques to move through times when they feel triggered, to develop that just personal awareness of what's going on within me when I'm feeling triggered. What's going on within me and what is behind that trigger? Is it shame? Is it guilt? Is it fear? And through that, to learn how to become aware of their nervous system and how they're feeling, and develop these techniques to strengthen their nervous system, physically strengthen their nervous system, to strengthen and deepen their breath, to help them move away from a trauma response into a space of greater clarity or greater control of their breath. But I don't believe that breath work can replace the amazing work that's done with a therapist, which I've done for years. But one thing that I found really helpful too in my group coaching, specifically with the work that I've done with the ARC group, is that instead of teaching, when we think of meditation, especially, you think of like these long sessions, but I do a lot of shorter sessions, a shorter 3-5 minute meditations. And afterwards, I guide people to become aware of their body, of what they're holding. And then we open up and give an opportunity for people to speak about what was challenging, what came up for them, what memories kind of came up. And there's something so powerful about speaking it out loud, about sharing it, about being witnessed in that way, where oftentimes, people see themselves reflected in that. And so I think, with meditation, often we do feel very alone, or we are alone in this meditation. In this meditative space, we're alone with our minds. And so this aspect of this group coaching, of opening it up to discussion and encouraging people to share and to hold space for each other in a safe space is the beginning of starting to uncover some of those physical sensations that we feel within our body, and teaching people ways, through breath work, to start to regulate their nervous system, to start to deepen their breath, to recognize when their mind is racing, and how to start to ground themselves in a very kind of holistic way. And one of the things that's so beautiful about this, and for me, one of the reasons why I love to teach this and why I do this myself, is that from that very first class that I took, I could see the difference in how I felt from the very beginning of the class to afterwards.
Describe it.
I felt like I had ran around a church. I felt like once energized, but also calm. And so one of the things that I often do is to tell people, like, at the beginning, is to notice what you're carrying at the beginning. And then after each exercise that we do, after each little breath meditation, is to become aware, to come back to that sensation and notice what has shifted for you physically, mentally, emotionally, to start to name it. What is that tension in your shoulders? And then what happens is that you start to realize when you're moving throughout your day, because we're constantly being triggered and, stressed out by different things. And so what happens is you start to relate to these sensations within your body, to these feelings. You start to wrap words around them, and you start to become and develop this relationship to your breath. And that for me is one of the things, is that I used to relate a lot to the stinking thinking, the thoughts in my mind and the stories of my past. And it was through the breath. And I realized that, what? Before I was diagnosed with ADHD, before I had a career, before all these things, my personality developed, I had my breath. And that was actually the beginning of my life. And that breath has a rhythm to it, and when I feel triggered, that breath shifts, it changes. Instead of breathing deeply to my belly, my breath is in my chest or in my throat. My posture is different. And so starting to relate to that presence of the breath within us, because the breath is always there, just like the mind and the thoughts are always there.
I always like the idea that when you're sort of in struggle, look for your breath. Because if you can't find it, you have much bigger problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when you panic that you can't find it, it's just to become aware of that and find that rhythm of the breath and start to develop that and start to, oftentimes people realize they're like, oh, one of the first things that happens when I teach this, people they'll realize that they're just so tense that they can't even sit still.
Yeah.
The other thing is that they realize that they can't breathe very deeply. And so sometimes there's judgment around that. And believe me, I know, I'm like, what does it feel like to realize I can't even breathe properly, And being able to laugh about that and just kind of understand that and just notice that or mourn it and say oh, there's something locked within me. There's tension here. Mm-hmm. And if there is tension, can we just create a little bit of space around that? Can we just spend some time with that? And so it's really, for me, it's been about not realizing that I'm not just living with my mind and with the thoughts and my past, but I'm living with my breath and that I'm never alone, because that's one of the things is, in meditation, we often feel alone, but you always have that breath. And I said that, when I lived in New York, I felt so alone. I never wanted to spend time by myself. And it was in cultivating this experience with my breath and realizing that my breath has never left my side. It's always with me.
When you were saying that, one of the things that came to my mind, I don't know if you ever read the book, The Wilderness by Brené Brown, where she quotes
Braving the Wilderness. Yeah. A beautiful book.
Where she quotes Maya Angelou, where she's talking about how belonging begins with yourself.
Yes.
Right. And I remember when I had to actually, I was listening to it, and I specifically remember being in Target listening to this. And I was like, wait, I felt like I wasn't grasping it at first. I had to rewind a whole chunk of it. And when you were just saying that, it kind of made me think and connect to that of, to belong, we have to occupy our own space, and that is connected to the mind and body. And only when that is connected are we actually able to show up in community and experience that sense of belonging, which is that experience that I think makes our communities so powerful. Is for so many people, this is the first time I've ever felt a true sense of belonging, but knowing that it really does begin with ourselves. Yeah, it's a kind of a, I want to say it's a kind of a heady thought, but that's kind of defeats the purpose of what we're talking about. We're trying to get into our body. You mentioned the term a couple times, or the phrase, a trauma response. And I think, sometimes I think that the word trauma is used in a really for any emotional reaction to something. When you use the word trauma response, how are you using that?
Well, I go back to, Gabor Maté's definition of trauma, and that one of the things he talks about is how that we all need to feel that sense of connection. First of all, the first connection is to ourselves, and that's to our gut instincts. So one of the things he talks about is that as humans, there's two fundamental needs that we have. One is for attachment. As a baby cannot fend for itself, and humans have the longest maturation cycle of all mammals. And so if a baby does not have that attachment of a parent or a caretaker, then they will just not survive, because a baby cannot feed itself. It cannot do anything. The one defense that a baby has is its connection to its authentic instincts, crying, when it's hungry, when it needs something. And one of the things that happens to us as we get older is we become disconnected from that authentic instinct that we have. So I'll give you an example, speaking out at a meeting with an opinion that may be different than somebody else. That may be an authentic, you may be feeling that, but we feel afraid to actually voice that out. Or we feel that that our rights are being violated in some way. We're feeling like we're not being seen or heard. And instead of actually acting on that, we choose not to, because we fear jeopardizing that attachment to the group. What will my boss say? What were people going to think? We become disconnected from that sense of our instincts, of our authenticity. And one of the things that happens is that we become disconnected from who we are physically, how we feel. And when we don't feel that sense of safety, what we developed is an intellect. We develop the mind to keep us safe. That shame that I've felt around ADHD, around telling people, or about maybe lack of focus. It's about being judged. And so I've learned how to hide it really well. And part of that is kind of denying that, even the sense of mourning that shame that I feel, that pain that I feel. What he talks about is that trauma is not it's not the terrible thing that happened. That's traumatic. That being bullied, that's traumatic. But the trauma is actually what happens within us, that we become disconnected to our sense of self, to our sense of who we are, our sense of goodness, our hope in ourselves, in the future, in other people. And that it's all too common. We all have some kind of version of that often. And so what he talks about is that in recovery, what we recover is our sense of self, is our sense of well-being, our sense of our connection to our physical body, to our breath, to our heart, to our future, to who we truly are, not just as people who have ADHD or people who have been bullied or have been abused or whatever that is, or maybe you didn't have the safety of a home where you had two parents who loved you. Maybe your parents were divorcing. And so trauma doesn't have to be necessarily a bad thing that happened, but it could also be that something good didn't happen, that maybe you didn't have the support of a teacher to protect you, to defend you when you were bullied, or just that space. And so what we recover that connection to ourselves, not just through our minds and who we think we are, but deep within ourselves, that connection to ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally. And that's when the intuition can arise. That's when that sense of self can arise, and we can move beyond just our past and be able to just be present with ourselves, with our breath, and show up for not just ourselves, but show up for others.
You mentioned attachment. About a year and a half ago or so, about a year ago, I was going through my divorce, and I read the book Attached, and this was this book that I was just like, man, if I would have read this book 10 years ago, like things would have been, it was a really eye-opening book, a very, very helpful book to understand like different attachment styles, and just it helps you understand, because I think that, when we think about, I asked you earlier about a trauma response. One of the things that I really appreciated learning about in this book was when you're sort of they refer to it as an attachment system being activated, right? So like in certain situations, I have an anxious attachment style, or in most situations I have a secure attachment style, but like being able to use that language that, I'm feeling like my anxious attachment style is being activated right now, was just a really helpful phrasing to be able to make sense of something that I was noticing happening in the body, because it allows a different story to potentially come out of that. Because I think that a lot of what trauma is, as you've been saying, it's not necessarily about what happened, but it's about meaning making. And when we can't, if something doesn't make sense, that's what is often the big driver, and almost like the fan that fuels the flame of trauma, is when we can't make sense of something. And so I think it does first begin when we're having this strong emotional response to something. Like we're grasping for straws to make sense of a very uncomfortable, sometimes very distressing physical emotion. So I just think that by being able to come back to the body through the breath, it sort of allows us to kind of go back even to that moment and take a different path. It doesn't change what has happened, because I think that a lot of us with ADHD do carry a lot of trauma. It is something that I'm hoping to see more and more of this talked about and researched, because I think it's a really significant component to the adult ADHD picture. It's like, I don't think there's that many communities of people where the sort of that rejection, that negative feedback is so significantly stacked. Right. And so it becomes that trauma by 1,000 paper cuts. It's that trauma by like, you're screwed up again. You forgot that thing again. You made that mistake again. And it's like, so anytime we make a mistake, it can often bring, that flood of other emotions sort of back. And so it's not just about that situation. It's about all the other experiences that we've had connected to that. And for so many people, they're not even realizing that it's not just that situation they're in that moment, but it's that full connection to all of that. So what I want to do really quickly, Alejandro, is take one more quick break, and then when we'll come back, and I don't know where we're going to go with that. So we're going to just be in the moment when we come back. So we will be right back. Get more done with the virtual co-working community built for adults with ADHD by adults with ADHD by going now to adultstudyhall.com. From our weekly guided and facilitated sessions to our 24/7 drop-in room, there are plenty of ways you can optimize your productivity to get more done using real-time accountability. It's only $19.99 a month, and it's free for the first week to try. And you can cancel your membership at any time. We've got themed and guided sessions, also known as Ash Plus sessions. We have them for writing, 2 a week for decluttering. We have sessions for job searches led by Kat Hoyer, our HR specialist and next season's spring coaching group coach. We have a session for your most dreaded tasks, 2 for working out, and other member-led sessions to start crossing off all of those to-dos. And once a month, I host a Pomodoro dance party, and this month's Pomodoro dance party will be on Thursday, January 27th at 1:30 p.m. Central, and we go just a little more than 2 hours. During this session, instead of our 25 minutes of a work block, then 5-minute work break, we're going to do it the same way we did last month, which is 2 50-minute work blocks mixed in with 10-minute dance breaks in between. It's amazing what some body movement can do for our brains. You don't have to be good at dancing, but we do ask that you dance if you can. If you want to join the virtual co-working community built just for us, you're invited. Head on over now to adultstudyhall.com to learn more about our Ash Plus sessions, our 24/7 drop-in room, and to stay up to date for our upcoming sessions. We have in the works a financial and tax prep session coming up. Details to be announced soon. The doors are open at adultstudyhall.com. Come work with us. That's adultstudyhall.com. All right, we are back. So you mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit about judgment and just talk a little bit about what you were just saying before we came back from the break.
Yeah. So I wanted to just, first of all, just thank you for sharing that. And one thing that you said is like, as soon as you said it, I was like, oh yes, me too. I wish I had read this book 10 years sooner. And I think that's such a common response for people. Is that we wish that we could have done this sooner. I wish I'd diagnosed sooner. I wish that I'd learned to meditate sooner. I wish that I had found this podcast sooner. And the thing is that if you could have, you would have.
Yeah.
And just kind of creating a little bit of space for that and just know that you are exactly where you're supposed to be and giving yourself that space. And also if there is a little bit of that judgment or if that any kind of pain connected with that, to just kind of just notice that. And let's just kind of take a deep breath, breathe into that and exhale. Because one of the things that happens with the mind is that the mind is trying to protect us. All of this judgment, all this shame is trying to keep us from not being laughed at, because chances are we were probably laughed at in the past. And so it's coming from a good place, but it may be outdated, that response may be a little bit outdated. And, the thing is, we don't realize it until we create a little bit of space to kind of connect with that. And it's really hard to do this work on your own. It's really hard to meditate on your own, especially at the beginning, because you can be feeling very lost and overwhelmed with so many of those thoughts. And that's why it's really important, I've found, to work within a group, to work with somebody else, to have somebody hold you and lead you through some of those challenging sensations that come up, those thoughts. And to remember that when those thoughts come up or when those triggers come up, is that there's something to become curious about there. First of all, to show a little bit of compassion to ourselves. Not to talk so much about Gabor, but one of the things he talks about is that when we think about triggers, if you think about a gun, that the trigger is the smallest part of the gun. The gun as an apparatus has ammunition. It has a whole apparatus. It's like there's so much more. But the thing that we obsess about is that one little trigger that sets it off. And so in the moment when, we're running late and we show up somewhere and we have to show our face and feel, there's not enough space in that moment to find a little bit of compassion to ourselves. We're so activated in those moments, but that's the moment that you may be triggered in that very same way the next time you're running late. And so these are the things that happen when we start to meditate. All these thoughts start to come up. And so creating a little bit of space around that, a little bit of curiosity around that, and recognizing what is behind this trigger in my past, where is it in my body? What am I feeling? What am I carrying around? Because whenever there's that emotional response, it's physically related in our body. But typically, the nervous system works two ways. The body connects to the brain and the brain communicates with the body. But 80% of the information is coming from the body to the brain. And that's why we often don't even realize that we're triggered. We often don't realize that we're mad. And somebody will ask you, well, what's wrong? And what do we say? Nothing, I'm fine, because they can see it on our face. But we don't even realize it. We think that we're kind of like hiding it, and I'm saying this about myself because I go through this too at times, These are the things that come up when you sit down to meditate. These are the things. And so it's creating space around that, creating curiosity, and being in an environment where you can have somebody who can hold that space for you. And knowing that the meditation didn't activate that within you, or maybe it could have activated that with you, but that's also within us. We're carrying so much of this tension, of this trauma within us, And so creating that little bit of space to just be with yourself, to create that self-awareness.
How is it to be meditating at home and hearing ambulances all the time?
Well, one of the things that I teach people, or I encourage people, is like, yeah, there's going to be sounds. Someone, and if you're in a room with people, someone might sneeze, or someone down the hall. And so it's, instead of fighting it or get angry about it, but then bring yourself back, make it part of your, one of the things that I teach, actually, because it's so funny that happened, is I always say, is like the power of thank you. Thank you, ambulance, for going by. And there's something that happens within me whenever I say thank you to something that just annoyed me. It's like my body responds in a way, my mind responds in a completely different way. And it's about just kind of creating that bit of space. And sometimes it brings a smile to my face, and it's just creating a little bit of that, releasing some of that resistance of all the things that we can't control.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we can control is our breath, is coming back to our breath, and noticing that and finding that rhythm through our breath, finding that awareness, because it's through that breath awareness that we build self-awareness. And that self-awareness creates space for you to experience some of those positive sensations and some of those negative sensations, and to build yourself back. And through that self-awareness, we build confidence, self-confidence. And what does it mean to confide? It's to be able to trust yourself, to be able to be with yourself. We were talking about community, and to commune is to be in connection with. So often I'm going to just use myself as an example. I'm so connected to my mind that I lose sight of my body, of what's going on physically within me, of my breath. We are the CEO of our bodies, and little by little, this growth happens, and it doesn't happen overnight. And that's one of the things about growth, is that, especially in the natural world, the earth is spinning right now. We can't feel it spinning. The sun is rising, it's setting. And winter started, recently. And every time winter happens, when it snows that very first day, if you're somewhere where it snows, it's like a surprise that, oh my God, winter's here. But actually, winter has been coming little by little. And that's how growth is that you may not see it with your eyes. You may not feel it within you, but it happens little by little. And someone may recognize it sooner than you do. They may say, hey, Eric, what have you been doing? You look so much more relaxed. So this used to really upset you, That's the way that growth works, and that's the way that things work in the natural world. They move really slowly. But in this day and age, I'm so used to pushing a button and getting things on demand. And, if that doesn't happen, if I can't, if something doesn't happen right away, I become impatient, and that's where it's like learning to kind of come back and create that space, to create a little bit of space for that patience and that curiosity, that awareness.
If we can pause for just a moment. I'm really curious. I'm always trying to imagine, listeners as I'm having these conversations for the podcast. And I really want to invite listeners to sort of check in with have your thoughts been preoccupied over the last minute or two about the sounds of the sirens? and how has your body responded to that? Were you able to stay connected to the conversation while that was happening, or did you become preoccupied with the sound of the sirens? And I think I was able to even pause myself the moment I thought about that, because I noticed that I was becoming preoccupied with these sounds of the sirens, and then I got curious. And then by being curious, I was able to kind of come back to the conversation. And all this happens in such a short, like a 5-second span.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we're having these experiences, we can either say, damn sirens, or say, all right, I'm noticing that I'm having a physical response to that. I'm noticing it's triggering a lot of thoughts. And so it's being able to sort of pause all of the things that are happening. I mean, to me, that's the beauty of anything that gets us back into our body.
Mm-hmm.
You said that breath work. What was it? You said something aware.
Breath awareness builds self-awareness.
Breath awareness builds self. I love that. Like if you haven't like put that on a t-shirt, you should, because that's. I mean, it really is. It's, right before COVID started, I was going to these weekly meditation groups in my community. Because I've always enjoyed the benefit of meditating. I've always had difficulty doing longer meditations on my own.
It's hard.
It's really hard. And one of the things that I always found so fascinating was when I was able to sort of suspend my skepticism of the woo-woo and enter a space and just be really get out of my head and just be physically present in that space. I have had there's been times where I didn't know where it came from, but I just the emotions that would just almost overcame me was huge in a way that was also really opening. I think it was very opening. It was like, oh, I've been holding on to this for not even sure where this was coming from. And I just found those sort of experiences to be really profound and sort of equally both difficult as well as sort of enriching. And I just think it's something. So as for listeners, if you're like, oh, I can't meditate, or this is a bunch of woo-woo BS, give it a chance. I'm very science minded. And about 2 years ago, I think I was telling you this, Alejandro, I went to a sound bath, which when I first was entering the space, and I was like, what the hell am I doing here? Right. I was in my head and I was judging, thinking this is the most woo woo BS. It was profound because the moment I was able to sort of let go of this is BS and just allow myself to experience it through the body. I remember after, so the leader was using these crystal bowls, and it had a really pretty loud resonance. And I remember going up to the instructor afterwards, and I just wanted to share. I said it was really strange, this experience of with one of the ones that you were resonating. That I felt like I wasn't hearing it outside. I felt like it was coming from in my mind. And he's like, well, that makes sense because that one's tuned to the crown chakra. And I'm just like, come on, what? And so it's just it's been I think a good practice for me to sort of allow myself to suspend some disbelief. Because I think sometimes I think being skeptical about stuff is a healthy thing to do, especially in this age of where science doesn't matter, right? But to also be able to be open to experiences and curious about it, and even curious about our own judgment about the judgment we're having, right?
Absolutely. And so the next step to what you were saying about notice how you responded to those ambulances, notice where in your body you felt that. Notice, did you start to grind your teeth? Were you holding
my breath? Yes.
Holding your breath. And the thing about holding your breath is that it's a physiological response. If you think about when you lift something heavy, what do? You hold your breath and you create tension in your body. I used to do this thing that I noticed when I was ever in a work meeting with people and I was waiting for my chance to speak, that I would hold my breath until it was my chance to speak. And I'd be like, I'd be like holding my breath, and I could see that other people could feel it. And then as soon as it was my time to talk, I'd be like, and I would just like say something. And it's just like, I realized something like, oh my God, because that's our nervous system. And the nervous system is there to protect you. And there's two, the autonomic nervous system is our fight or flight. It's both our fight or flight, and it's our rest and relaxation. And so through breath work, this is a whole nother thing, is understanding the rhythms of our breath and noticing, how to ease a fight or flight response. And noticing that sometimes, and even like you said, the self-judgment around things that are new to us or that are woo-woo or something, it's like, oh, maybe behind that there's some, it's about a conspiracy theory, or maybe we had a bad experience in the past, or we heard about something, and becoming curious around that and noticing that, oh, this is me looking out for myself. But one of the things about breath work that I think is so powerful is that within just a few minutes of shifting how you breathe, you will feel it. And you'll know, and you'll be like, oh, how did I feel? This is what I ask people. I'm like, remember how you're feeling before, and how are you feeling now? What are you feeling? And coming back to that sound, or that, and building this relationship to yourself through your breath. And it's also a very creative and very creative technique that you can include a lot of visualization to just learn to just be with yourself and to find a little bit of peace within you. And the thing that the thing that I really loved about this when I first started to learn this is that it's available to you all the time. The breath is with you all the time. And so you can learn to cultivate that relationship to your breath, and you don't need anything. Instead of looking for something outside of you, something to relax you, or something to energize you, coffee or something, you can come back to your breath and learn how to start to become more aware and to start to ease that and build that relationship to yourself, not through your mind, not through your past, but through your breath, which is always with you.
Alejandro Santiago, I want to thank you so much. Now, we are going to have you back to come on and do something kind of special for us. You're going to lead us on the podcast through a guided meditation. So watch that in your podcast feed. It will either come out next week, or we might drop a midweek episode to kind of support this one, because we want you to be able to have some actual takeaway strategies and experience the power of getting out of your head and into your breath. Alejandro Santiago, I think the website is alejandrosantiago.com.
Yes, that's right. ALEJANDROSANTIAGO.com. And I just want to say thank you so much, Eric, for having me and for all the work that you do, bringing people together around this, around ADHD and topics that, often there's not space for us to kind of connect with, and being able to be open with ourselves and to share with each other, and realize, that our vulnerabilities are opportunities for us to connect. And that when we can speak to that, when we can learn to be with those, that we're able to connect much deeper with ourselves and with others. And I'm so grateful for all the work that you've done. It's helped me so much. And it's one of the reasons why I do what I do. I feel really inspired by what you do. And I love working with people one-on-one and working, in group settings, as we do with the art group, because we have a weekly class together. And it's amazing to see people just ease into themselves, to learn how to just learn to be with themselves in a space of peace in this world where there's so much uncertainty, is to find a little bit of that within you. It's such a gift. So thank you.
Thank you. This is Eric Tivers. Thank you for listening, and congratulations for making it to the end. ADHD reWired is more than just a podcast. We are a community focused on learning, growing, and connection. The website is ADHDrewired.com. You can find time-stamped summaries and additional resources for each episode. Apply to join our free and secret Facebook community. Learn more about our award-winning intensive online video-based coaching and accountability groups. Join the Adult Study Hall virtual co-working membership community. Find all the other podcasts on the ADHD reWired podcast network. Sign up for my email newsletter to get exclusive content that you won't hear anywhere else. And use the search tool to find episodes on specific topics. You can do all of this at ADHDrewired.com. While you're there, click on the Patreon button. If you are a regular listener, consider making a monthly contribution by becoming a patron. If you are able to financially support my work, it would mean a lot. This show is free to you, the listener, but it's not free to produce. Plus, patrons get cool perks like ad-free episodes and access to recordings of coaching calls, and $25 a month patrons can join me once a month for a group coaching call. You can follow me on Twitter at Eric Tivers. You can like our Facebook page at facebook.com/ADHD rewired. If you're a coach, therapist, or related professional, connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/Eric Tivers. Subscribe to ADHD Rewired on YouTube to see selective interviews and other videos I've made. Podcasts change lives. You can make a difference in someone's life by spreading the word about this podcast. Mention it in your online communities on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or wherever you hang out online. And be sure to share it with your friends, family, your therapists, your coaches, doctors, siblings, parents. And if you, your coach, therapist, doctor, or ADHD support group leader would like a pack of podcast postcards to hand out, you can request those at the website, ADHDrewired.com. If you are a member of CHAD, ADA, or any other ADHD support group, please be sure to tell them about this show and all the shows on the ADHD Rewired Podcast Network. You can even show them how to download it on their phone. And if you really loved this particular episode, please hit share on your podcast player. I'm only one person, and I do count on you to help spread this message. One of the biggest things that you can do to support this podcast and help other people discover it is to leave an honest rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other app that supports reviews. And don't forget to hit subscribe so new episodes are automatically pushed to your favorite podcast app. Looking for more ways to listen and learn? Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at Audible by going to audibletrial.com/ADHD rewired. Here is my list of must-listen-to audiobooks updated July 2021. Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. Attached by Amir Levin and Rachel Heller. Atomic Habits by James Clear. The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. Crucial Conversations by Carrie Patterson. The Coaching Habit by Michael Stainer. The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Rest by Alex Sujong Kim Pang. The 5-Second Rule by Mel Robbins. Make It Stick. The Science of Successful Learning by Peter Brown. The Productivity Project by Chris Bailey. Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics by Dan Harris. Change Your Questions, Change Your Life by Marilee G. Adams. I always recommend to my coaches and admin that they read that book. The One Thing by Gary Keller, a required reading for all of our coaching group members. Procrastinate on Purpose by Rory Baden. The 4 Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. And if you're looking for something a little bit more magical, I have fallen in love with the Harry Potter series, and the narrator, Jim Dale, is amazing. And of course, if you haven't yet boarded the Brene Brown bus, all of her stuff is great, starting with Gifts of Imperfection, Daring Greatly, Rising Strong, and The Power of Vulnerability. And if you're an entrepreneur or leader, be sure to check out her book, Dare to Lead. Do you have something that you would like to share? Click on the podcast tab at ADHD Rewired. Click the button to be a guest at the top of the page and schedule a 15-minute interview. This is Eric Tivers, reminding you to keep learning, growing, and connecting. Self-care is not selfish. No matter what you get done or don't get done, you are still enough. And no matter how hard it feels, we can do hard things. And we don't need to do them in the hardest way possible. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next week.